welcome everyone to this beautiful spring evening. My name is Michael, for those of you who have not met me before, and welcome to our 15th Zoom webinar. We are very grateful that you have taken the time to join us on this beautiful afternoon or morning, wherever you might be in the world. I'm very honored to have Professor Mike Bruton with us today. He is a retired ichthyologist, which means a fish guru. And although the title of this webinar is Finding Old Fourlegs, we really are going to focus on the people behind the drama. And we're very fortunate that Mike has personally known many of these people that he's going to talk about and has spent many of his years in East London, knowing and working at the museum and knowing the people behind the story. So we'll cross over to you, Mike, now in Rondebosch. And thank you for taking the time to prepare this talk for us this evening. We really appreciate it. Just a reminder that this conversation is being recorded, and for anyone who might miss it, we will be loading it on to all of the social media platforms so you can share it at a later stage. So over to you, Mike. Thank you again for taking the time to share your story with us.
Right, thank you very much, Michael. It's a great pleasure to be with the WCC again. I'm a great supporter of your organization and glad to hear that your AGM went off successfully. So this evening's fireside chat, we're going to be talking about the characters behind one of the greatest biological discoveries of the 20th century. I'm going to be reporting based on the research I did for various books, my autobiography, various books on the coelacanth, and then books on some of the key characters. Now, the only character I'm going to mention who I didn't personally know, because he lived about 100 years before I did, was Louis Agassi, and he started the whole story by discovering the fossil of an unknown group of fishes in England, which he called Coelacanths, which means hollow spine, which was a characteristic of this group of fishes. Agassi himself was a fascinating individual. He was a Swiss-American glaciologist and paleontologist who became one of the best known and respected natural historians in the world. In 1847, he emigrated to the USA, to Harvard University, and he established the Museum of Comparative Zoology there, which is regarded as one of the great museums in the world. And despite the fact that he was such an authority on natural history and evolution, he didn't believe in Darwin's theory of evolution. He, in fact, proposed an alternative theory called polygenism. But enough of that. After Agassi found those first coelacanth fossils, and that was back in 1839, coelacanth fossils have been found on every continent, including Africa and Antarctica. And in fact, over 100 extinct species of coelacanths are known from the fossil record. So it wasn't as if the group of fishes was unknown. It's just that they were thought to have gone extinct. In fact, there's still very active research going on coelacanth fossils, and some of it right here in South Africa, by Robert Guess of the Albany Museum. And he's described recently a new species of estuarine coelacanths, Heronychthys cowiensis, from the Cowie River catchment. And you can see it pictured there. Now, just to give one some perspective of what the coelacanth group lived through, not of course the current species, but the group as a whole. They originated about 440 million years ago. About halfway through this time, during the time of Pangaea, 200 million years before present, this is what the continents looked like, and coelacanths were in the seas at that time. In fact, coelacanths preceded the first dinosaurs by 180 million years, so they really are serious survivors. And here's an image, rather hypothetical, because it shows the modern species of coelacanths coexisting with the dinosaurs. Would have been other species living with the dinosaurs. And in fact, we even have evidence that at least one species of African dinosaur, Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, 8 coelacanths because we found fossil coelacanths in fossil spinosaur stomachs. How about that? But then that cataclysmic event took place 65 million years ago, the Great Cretaceous extinction, where almost all the large animal species on land, in the air, and underwater went extinct. And the coelacanth fossil record ends there, and it was logical to conclude that they had gone extinct with the dinosaurs. Now, the first character in the story of the living coelacanth is, of course, Professor JLB Smith. Now, I happen to have one of his pith helmets, so I'll just put it on, you know, while I'm talking about JLB Smith. He was an extraordinary man, one of the great South Africans of his generation. He grew up in the Karoo, where his father was a postmaster, and there you can see little Len, as he was called then, 3 to 4 years old, in the sailor suit, which he apparently hated. And one can only imagine, what did this young kid living in the arid Karoo, looking at kogelmannetjies and things like that, how did he develop his love of the sea and of fishes? There's a later photograph, when he was 8 years old, of his father and mother. His father was often away from home, and his mother was a rather bitter woman who felt she'd married below her station, so he didn't have a particularly happy childhood. But the happiest of his days were when he went to Knysna with his family on holiday. And here you can see the house in which they stayed and the Cape cart in which they traveled from the train station in George. And that's where he caught his very first fish, a blacktail. And he's in Old Fourlegs, his autobiographical book about the coelacanth, he describes that thrilling event very graphically. While the Smith family was, when they eventually moved to the coast, they moved to Somerset West, and JLB, or Len, was able to attend diocesan college, Bishops. And there his science teacher was Barty Sutton, who made a big impression on him. And JLB got involved in the school museum, which had been established some decades before, and which he continued to develop. He then went on to Victoria College, which became Stellenbosch University, where he had an exceptional academic career, receiving first-class passes and first in South Africa. But he was also quite a mischievous student. I haven't got time to cover that, but in my book on him, The Fishy Smiths, I describe some of the extraordinary pranks they got up to as students. After completing his MSc at Stellenbosch, JLB went on to Cambridge University. He received virtually every scholarship and bursary and so on that was available to a South African student to travel abroad. And he did his PhD there on mustard gases, because at this stage of his life, his core interest was in organic chemistry. And he had become quite authoritative already in this field, and his work on mustard gases had a great impact on laws that were passed after the First World War about banning the use of mustard gas. But while in England, JLB took the opportunity to go fishing, and here you can see him with a long rod fishing in one of the rivers there. But eventually, after completing his PhD, he went to Grahamstown. Arrived there in 1923 as a senior lecturer in chemistry at Rhodes University College. He had a formidable professor in Sir George Corey, who, like JLB Smith, started his career in one field, chemistry, and then changed to another field, in Corey's case, history, sort of mid-career. JLB had an exceptionally successful career as a lecturer and researcher in organic chemistry. He was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society, and he nurtured some of the best organic chemists that South Africa's ever produced, including Doug Rivet here. And one of the key projects they did work on was on the vital ingredients of indigenous plants, such as buchu. And in fact, their research laid the foundation for the buchu industry of today. At that time, JLB Smith married Henriette Pinaar, who was from a famous rugby family called the Rugby Pinaars. In fact, her elder brother, Theo, was captained the first Springbok rugby team to tour Australia. Henriette was a very indoor sort of person, a very homely person, an excellent mother. They had 3 children together, but soon rifts began to develop in their marriage. JLB had a great interest in sports. Here he is at a swimming gala. And there he is with Robert, the eldest son that they had. And what I find extraordinary, during all my 18 years in the Ichthyology Institute in Grahamstown, no one ever told me that JLB Smith had a first marriage before Margaret Smith and that he had 3 children. And the reason why his marriage split up was because JLB used every opportunity to go to the coast to go fishing, because he had been advised by his medical doctors that he needed to improve his health and need to spend as much time outdoors as possible. So he used that as an excuse to go fishing. And on the right, you can see the ox wagon that he used to use to go to Hamburg on the Eastern Cape coast. And there he is scooting across Knysna Lagoon in his pith helmet, his aluminium boat and his dog Marlin. Now, from 1931 onwards, JLB Smith started to publish papers, scientific papers on marine fishes, because he found that many of the fish he caught, he couldn't identify, and the books that were available were very inadequate. And he illustrated his first publications. In the top right, you can see a rather diagrammatic illustration, which he was criticized for, so he claims to have spent over 10,000 hours developing his skill. And you can see one of his color paintings in the main image. Someone who was a great influence on him at this time was Dr. Keppel Barnard, then at the South African Museum in Cape Town. They were in regular correspondence. In fact, it's quite extraordinary. Some days they exchanged 2 or 3 letters in one day. And in that period, 31 to 38, JLB Smith published 17 papers. And remember, he's an amateur ichthyologist. And he even described 35 new species. And that set the scene for the discovery of the coelacanth. Here's another key man in that whole drama, Captain Hendrik Quissen. He was the skipper of the steam trawler Narini, take my hat off now, who is in the habit of collecting fishes for the East London Museum. And on the 23rd of December 1938, he brought his catch in to the East London harbour, landed it on this wharf, which is now known as Latimer's Landing, and called the East London Museum, and the curator there, Marjorie Courtney Latimer, and said, "I have another collection of fishes for you. Please come and have a look at them." Marjorie was very busy at the time, mounting a skeleton of a mammal-like reptile, but she decided, as 2 days before Christmas, to go down to the wharf, mainly to thank the crew for their help over the previous year. She rummaged through the pile of fish, mainly sharks and rays, and didn't see anything particularly interesting, and was about to leave the ship when she noticed a blue fin sticking out. And she asked them to remove the other fish, and what was revealed was what she described as the most beautiful fish she'd ever seen. She took it to the East London Museum, and which was very poorly equipped for large specimens at the time, wheeled it around on a 2-wheel cart all over East London, trying to find somewhere to refrigerate it or preserve it in formalin, but eventually in desperation took it to an amateur taxidermist who mounted it rather badly, it seems, and preserved it for science. Now, just a little bit about Marjorie, in case you didn't hear my previous talk about her. She came from a very poor family. Her father was a railway station master, and as a result of that, he was constantly transferred from one railway station in the interior of South Africa to another. And her family, Marjorie had 5 sisters and 2 stepsisters, were constantly on the move, living in 26 different places in the first 25 years of her life. She received very little formal schooling, but her mother was an excellent naturalist, and I used every opportunity to take the girls out into the field to study plants and animals, soils, geology, fossils, and all of them became accomplished natural historians, but especially Margaret. A breakthrough moment in her career was when she was able to spend 6 weeks on Bird Island in Algoa Bay. And she was in absolute paradise there. Although it's probably the noisiest, smelliest, windiest place on the planet, she loved it. She collected 15 crates of specimens for the East London Museum. And it was Captain Goosen who transported them back to East London for her. Another Smith in her story was Gigi Smith, the chairman of the board of the East London Museum. He was an engineer who became very devoted to the museum. In fact, for 20 years, he was effectively the voluntary chief operating officer of the museum. He resigned from his own engineering company and helped Margaret develop the East London Museum. But in particular, he took her on collecting expeditions throughout Southern Africa and up into Mozambique and Zimbabwe and Namibia, collecting plants and animals for her museum. So although Margaret knew very little about fishes, she was a very competent natural historian. She knew about taxonomy and diagnostic characters. And when she saw the coelacanth, she realized this is something very special. So she did this famous sketch on the right of the coelacanth. And although it looks rather amateurish, she in fact identified the key diagnostic characters of the coelacanth: the heavy bony plates on the head, the lobed fins, the large scales, and especially that extra lobe in the tail fin. And she sent this in a letter to JLB Smith, who was at the time on holiday in Knysna. Now, Margaret's diagram has become one of the most famous sketches in the history of zoology and has been compared to Darwin's famous I think diagram, in which he sketches out his ideas of how animal relationships developed over time. Now, JLB had a laboratory in his holiday cottage in Knysna, and when he received the letter, he was absolutely gobsmacked, because he had a knowledge of fossil fishes, and based on that simple drawing, he realized that this is a coelacanth and something very special was about to happen. But he had to be extremely careful because he was still an amateur ichthyologist. He didn't want to embarrass Margaret. So he contacted Keppel Barnard, who rushed through some books on fossil fishes, and Smith was able to confirm the identity. For various reasons, it was 44 days before he was able to get to the East London Museum, and there he examined the fish with Margaret, confirmed it was a coelacanth, and said, "This fish will take you and your museum around the world," and how true those words were. It caused a total sensation worldwide. Media all over picked up the story, and for one of the first times in South African history, South African science was in the international arena. Now, the first mounting of the specimen by the amateur taxidermist in East London was very poor. So Margaret decided, and her board supported her, that she needed to go down to the South African Museum to have it properly mounted. And this is where another interesting character comes into the story, James Drury. He was a highly competent taxidermist who's perhaps most famous or infamous for his life-size models of sand people modeled from real people, which are no longer on public display. You can see them top right and the early picture of the South African Museum on top left. Now, Drury did a magnificent job of mounting the specimen, and the one that you see in the East London Museum today is the one that he mounted. I haven't got time to go into the rest of Margaret's career, but she became one of the most decorated and distinguished museum directors in South African history. Even though she never achieved matric, she eventually got an honorary doctorate from Rhodes University and was recognized worldwide for her contributions to science. She had a species of plant, Lachenalia latimeri, Margaret's fiolki, named after her, and 2 subspecies of birds as well. But let's get back to the coelacanth story. That first coelacanth, unfortunately, had been badly dissected and the internal organs had been thrown away. So JLB Smith decided with his second wife, Margaret, that they must find another coelacanth so he could examine the internal organs, which of course are not protected in the fossil record, are not recorded. And this is where another great character enters the coelacanth story, and that's Margaret Mary Mcdonald. She was a student of JLB Smith in her second and third year studying chemistry. She was lectured by him, and somehow the chemistry of the two got together. JLB had just recently divorced his first wife, and at the end of her BSc, when Margaret told her that, oh, she is going to Johannesburg and will be studying medicine, he said to her, oh, no, you're not. You're staying right here, and you're going to help me develop my ichthyology career. And somewhat reluctantly at first, she agreed, and she really didn't know what she was letting herself in for. Because just over a year later, the first coelacanth was discovered. They also had their first son, who was born just a few weeks before the coelacanth. And immediately after the end of the Second World War, the two of them set off on collecting expeditions into parts of Mozambique that are still remote today. So you can imagine how remote they were in the 1940s. They lived in very primitive places. They slept in lighthouses, they slept under the stars or in homemade tents, and they used the local traditional fishermen and their outrigger canoes to collect fish. Here's JLB with a deadly stonefish, and in fact he was nearly killed by a stonefish when it jabbed him, and it was only through Margaret's knowledge of first aid and chemistry that she was able to save his life. Now, their son, William, they only had one child. He accompanied them on the later expeditions, and there you can see him on the left, and proved to be a very competent collector and diver. And just to say that William went on to have a glittering career of his own. On the top left is the new Volkswagen Beetle that he bought with proceeds from lecturing to his own fellow students. In his second year, he was lecturing to first-year students on chemistry. Such was his grasp of the subject. He went on to receive his postgraduate degrees at Rhodes and University of Natal. It took 14 years before JLB Smith found another coelacanth. And during that time, he collected hundreds of thousands of fishes along the East African coast, all the way from South Africa up through Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, but he didn't have the means of going to the offshore islands, for instance, of Madagascar and the Comores, although he did get to the Seychelles. Now, during his time at Cambridge, when he was studying massive gases, JLB also studied explosives. And here he is making a bomb, a homemade bomb. And he used to drop these in the water, and they would explode in mid-water and stun the fish, and the fish would rise to the surface, and then he could collect them. And on the whole, this went off very smoothly, but they had a few mishaps. On one occasion, Margaret, who always had to row the boat, he dropped a bomb. He told her, row like hell, which she did, but then a swell brought them back to right over the bomb, which exploded. The boat and the two of them went flying in the air. And JLB Smith describes it that he hoped that he would die because he didn't want to live as an invalid. But to his surprise, he was still alive. He looked around, saw some interesting fishes, which he collected, and then looked up to see if his wife was all right. There you can see JLB and Margaret going through a collection of fishes. JLB, of course, was a taxonomist. He would identify the fish, and Margaret's responsibility was as an artist to illustrate them. She had no formal training whatsoever in art and illustration, but she realized it was imperative that they capture the live colors before they faded, so she trained herself up as an artist and became one of the best fish artists in the world. On the left is a map which I found in one of JLB Smith's expedition diaries, and it shows the coast of northern Mozambique and the offshore islands. And this is where they were doing their collection. And interestingly, the most recent research using satellite imagery are trying to find places which have the right topography, the right submarine canyons and so on. That very same coast has been identified as probably the best place for coelacanths to live. Now, the collections they made were taken back to this rather primitive abode, the Department of Ichthyology, which was an ex-Anglo-Boer War building from the late 1800s. And all JLB Smith's famous research on the coelacanth was done in these primitive surroundings. So there he and Margaret are with their collection. And in that building, they produced these phenomenal books. The first one, 1949, The Sea Fishes of Southern Africa, of which JLB Smith was the sole author. Then Smith's Sea Fishes, once again, he was the sole author. And then eventually after he died, Margaret and Phil Heemstra were the editors of a multi-authored volume. Now let's look at how the second coelacanth was found. On one of their expeditions in 1952, they called in at Zanzibar. And here we meet yet another character, Eric Hunt on the right. He was a very well-educated man from England. He'd been to top schools there, but he decided on a life of adventure. So he bought a schooner and he was trading between Dar es Salaam, the Comores, and Madagascar. And he met JLB Smith. He saw the reward poster that he'd offering a reward for a coelacanth, and he undertook to try to find one. And when they shook hands and said goodbye, Hunt said, "You'll hear from me," and everyone laughed because they didn't believe it. The Smiths returned to Durban on a Union Castle liner, the Dunnotar Castle. And when they arrived in Durban in December 1952, there was a telegram waiting for them from Eric Hunt saying he had found a coelacanth on Anjouan Island, please come and get it. Now this created a real dilemma for JLB Smith, because how do you get to the Comores when there are no regular airlines or sea trips 2 days before Christmas and thinking, you know, the fish is rotting in the tropical heat. Now, he'd previously had bad experiences with politicians. Although Jan Smuts was an established scientist, in addition to being a politician, an ex-president of the Royal Society of South Africa, and a published author, he was not supportive at all of JLB Smith's research. But of course, by 1952, Smuts had been put out of power, the National Party had come in, and there was a new array of politicians that JLB had to deal with. And he contacted all of them, the Minister of Transport, Economic Affairs, Internal Affairs, begging them to make a military plane available to take him, as a journalist later said, to take a mad scientist to a foreign country to fetch a dead fish. Eventually, desperation, late at night, the day before Christmas, he phoned, a day after Christmas, he phoned the Prime Minister, Dr. D.F. Malan. And it so happened that Malan was a keen angler, and he had a copy of the Smith Sea Fishes book on his bedside in his holiday cottage in the Strand. And he realized the man who wrote that book would not phone him for a trivial reason. And quite remarkably, Malan agreed on the spot to provide a military aeroplane and crew, Dakota, to fly Smith to the Comores to fetch his fish. And this Dakota is the only one in its class. It's still in flying condition. It's called the Flying Fish Cart, and it's at the Asa Plaat Air Force Base in Cape Town. So JLB Smith was collected in Durban. They flew up the coast of Mozambique. And the remarkable thing about this trip is they didn't even know if there was an airstrip big enough in the Comores for them to land. Such was their faith in the crew and in the aircraft, they went anyway. And as they arrived near Dzaoudzi, and they circled the airstrip, JLB Smith asked Commandant Blow, "Is the strip okay for us to land?" And Blow said, "No, it's not." And JLB Smith said, "Well, what are we going to do?" And he said, "Well, we're going to land anyway." So they landed, and there was Captain Hunt at the airport, who then took him to the schooner and opened the box where the coelacanth was lying. And this is a historic photograph in December 1952 of JLB Smith with Commandant Blow. On the extreme left is Eric Hunt with that famous second coelacanth. Now, in the next slide, there's some sound. So I hope it's going to work for you. I'm just going to put it on now. And this is the speech that JLB Smith gave when he returned to Durban in the Dakota with the second coelacanth. And remember, he hadn't slept for about 3 nights. He was absolutely exhausted, but a journalist shoved a microphone in his face and said, "Please tell us what happened." And for 40 minutes, he spoke without interruption about this epic find.
Eventually, we got away.
Mike, it's not coming through on our side at all.
Okay. All right, sorry, I believe the sound is not coming through. That's a great pity because it was a very emotional interview that JLB Smith gave, which was broadcast all over the world by BBC and NBC and became quite famous. Eventually, they got to Durban and JLB Smith said, the very first person I want to show the coelacanth to is the Prime Minister, Dr. Malone. So the crew were instructed to fly on to Cape Town, and there they are at Oysterplaat Airport. And there on the right is JLB Smith showing the fish to Dr. Malone. And Dr. Malone is reputed to have said, "It's so ugly, are we really descended from it?" And JLB Smith replied, "I've known uglier people." JLB decided, at the encouragement of Margaret, to write up the story of the first and second coelacanths, which he published in 1956 under the name of Old Fourlegs, the story of the coelacanth. And this became one of the first international science bestsellers. It sold over 800,000 copies in 9 foreign languages and Braille, and really took South African science around the world again. And there's JLB with D.F. Malone with a presentation copy of the book. There you can see on the left some of the foreign language editions. And in some cases, it was the first time a book written by a South African had been published in another language, such as Japanese and Slovakian and so on. Well, after that, JLB Smith decided that he was done with the coelacanth. When additional specimens were offered to him, he said they should be sent to other museums, and he busied himself on work on other fishes. He also did a great deal to stimulate freshwater ichthyology in South Africa, and there you can see JLB and Margaret with the Jubbs, Rex and Hilda Jubb, who became the freshwater equivalents of them. JLB also had a big role in the establishment of the Oceanographic Research Institute and SeaWorld in Durban, now known as Ushaka Marine World. And at that time, he and Margaret also published this book on the fishes of the Seychelles. JLB Smith committed suicide in January 1968. His health was failing, his eyesight was going, and he didn't want to be a burden on society. So he took his own life by swallowing a poison. Posthumously, these 2 books, popular books on South African fishes, were published, Our Fishes and High Tide, and they're still very readable today. Now, Margaret started off as an amateur self-taught ichthyologist and artist, but became a very formidable science administrator and ichthyologist in her own right. She lobbied Rhodes University and the CSIR to establish a Fish Research Institute in JLB Smith's name, and miraculously, within 8 months, she got a decision and funding from them. She then did a world tour to gather ideas on designing a Fish Research Institute and submitted her ideas to an architect, and that led to the establishment of what was first called the JLB Smith Institute of Ichthyology, now the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity in Grahamstown or Makonda. And it is indeed one of the leading fish research institutes in the world. I was fortunate to take over from Margaret as a director of that institute, and she was a marvelous person to work with after she retired, because she never interfered, but she was always available to give advice if requested. After the second coelacanths continued to be caught in the Comores and brought to the attention of scientists in the West. And the next character to come on board is Dr. Jacques Milo. He was stationed in Tanana and Tanarivo in Madagascar, and in fact was an invertebrate expert whose main interest was spiders. But as soon as the coelacanth story broke, and they heard of this fish jacking by JLB Smith, who'd stolen a fish, one of the most famous fish in the world, from a French possession at the time, he switched his interest to the coelacanth. It so happened that Milo was also the first Western scientist to see a live coelacanth when he was called to the Comores after one had been caught and kept alive in a flooded, sunken boat. And he recorded his observations in a paper in Nature. But he became most famous for his extremely detailed dissections of the coelacanth, which went way beyond what JLB Smith was able to do. And over a period of some 17 years, Milo and colleagues published extensively on the anatomy of the coelacanth. And they're just, this talk's not about the coelacanth, but just to point out some of the main features. It's got a bony head, it's got bony supports to the fins, but it has a cartilaginous backbone like a shark. And this is the amazing thing about the coelacanth. It didn't follow the rules. It's a sort of potpourri of all sorts of different solutions to the challenges posed by evolution. Now, Captain Planet, as Jacques Cousteau is known, was also a character in the coelacanth story, but remarkably an unsuccessful character. He probably saw more species of live fishes than any other scientist in his lifetime, but he never saw a living coelacanth. And that's not for lack of trying, because he took the Calypso and his crew to the Comores and Madagascar, and they searched and searched, but they had been misled by a British scientist, E.M. White, who said the coelacanth lives in very deep water, whereas JLB Smith, who as an angler knew live fishes, predicted that they would be a relatively shallow living species, and he was absolutely right. Most coelacanths live between about 150 and 400 meters, which by ocean standards is not deep at all. Now, another interesting character of this story was Dr. James Atz at the American Museum of Natural History. Oddly enough, Americans didn't play much of a role in the coelacanth story. And this was rather a bizarre role, because JLB Smith was offered a coelacanth, said, no, I don't want it, send it to the AMNH, and they gratefully accepted it, preserved it, and put it in storage. And it remained in storage for over a decade before they decided to dissect it. And when they dissected it, they made the most surprising discovery. Firstly, that coelacanths have the largest eggs of any fish, the size of an orange, and they don't have mermaid's eggs like JLB Smith had predicted. But secondly, that the coelacanth, in the coelacanth, the eggs hatch inside the mother, and the yolk provides food for the young, and they are born as baby coelacanths, which look very similar to the adults. But they're quite big, about 33 centimeters long, half a kilogram, and the mother carries between 6 and about 36 is the maximum for any particular group of births. Now, what we subsequently found is that the gestation period of the coelacanth between fertilization and birth is a phenomenal 36 months, 3 years, which is much more than the previous longest one for the African elephant of 22 to 24 months. Now, after I became director of the Smith Institute, I initiated a new research program on the living coelacanth in the Comores. So off we went to the Comores, and the first thing we did was meet with fishermen who'd caught coelacanths. And here we'd been offered a coconut cocktail by the fishermen, and I'm sitting with Robin Stobbs, and we're chatting about where they caught the fish, at what depth, etc. And we gathered a lot of very useful information in that way. So let's remember the role of the traditional fishermen, because they had been catching coelacanths for centuries. They knew it by the name of gombessa. To them, it was a sacred animal, something very special. And in fact, they caught it by accident because they weren't targeting it. We also met a local diver, Jean-Louis Giraud. And I said to him, Jean-Louis, I believe you have a coelacanth specimen of your own. He said, yes. And I said, well, where is it? He said, it's under my bed. So we had a look under his bed, and there it was, a dried male coelacanth. And Jean-Louis was a great help. He took us to dive sites and introduced us to the fishermen. We also examined records of coelacanths in the Comores, and this is something called a gyotaku, which is a Japanese fish print. And the way they are made is you actually paint the fish. And having painted the fish, you then wrap some white calico over it, and you rub it, and then you peel it off, and details of the fish come through on the calico. And I have one of these hanging in my lounge that I made myself. Then the next fascinating character comes into the coelacanth story. Professor Dr. Hans Friedke, originally from East Germany, and there top left you can see he was a very adventurous youth. He went on a bicycle trip in the Sahara Desert. He read the German edition of Old Fourlegs, and from a fairly young age as a scientist, he decided he was going to be the first person to photograph a living coelacanth in its natural environment. His initial work using a research submersible called GEO was done in the Red Sea, and in the background of the photo on the right, you can see a house, an underwater house in which Hans used to live while he was doing his research in the Red Sea. And on the left, you can see him in the Comores with a dried coelacanth. He tried initially to find coelacanths with the GEO, but she had a depth limit of 200 meters, and they realized they weren't going deep enough. So he made another submersible, the JGO, but they were also initially unsuccessful in finding coelacanths until they consulted with a traditional fisherman who laughed at them and said, why are you diving during the day? The coelacanths are active at night. So they dived at night. On the very first dive, they found coelacanths. And there you can see juxtaposed on the left, traditional fisherman in his dugout canoe, and the fishes on the right. The top one is the oil fish that they normally target, and the bottom one is the one they use as bait. And this is one of the famous photographs that Hans took, living up to his promise of being the first person to photograph the live fish in its natural habitat. And he and his crew studied the coelacanth for over 22 years. And because the pattern of white dots on each coelacanth is unique, like a footprint, they got to know not just the species, but individuals within the species. And some of them they tracked over nearly 2 decades. And it's some of the most detailed research that's ever been done on a fish. So from a fish, which everyone thought had gone forever, had gone extinct, it's now one of the best known fish on the planet. A key member of Hans's team was Karen Hessmann, avid conservationist. And here you can see her doing a bit of graffiti in Moroni. This was in response to a Japanese ship that was trying to catch coelacanths. And she wrote there, let them be where they are. And Hans and his crew actually did a bit of a mischievous thing. One night they crept, using their submersible, they found the trap that the Japanese had set in the sea for coelacanths and put a note in it. And the Japanese were horrified the next day to find a note written by humans in their fish trap. We also did research on the coelacanths by removing tissues, removing scales, and on the right, we're removing a sample for DNA from the specimen in the East London Museum. So because it's such a placid, slow swimming fish, you could actually approach it in a submersible and remove a scale from it. Because I was mainly involved in the logistics and fundraising and administration of coelacanth research, I didn't have many opportunities to dive, but here I am in the Jago at about 198 meters off the south coast of Grand Comore. And this is the view we had in the cave, and the arrow points to the end of a coelacanth's tail. And I spent a wonderful few hours in a cave down there, like being transported back 200 or 300 million years, seeing a coelacanth in its natural environment. Well, after that, coelacanths started to pop up all along the east coast of Africa. This is a publication when we published the finding of a coelacanth in Mozambique. And then, surprise, surprise, on the other side of the Indian Ocean, this couple, Mark Erdman and Arnos Murta, found a coelacanth in Indonesia. This happened in 1997, and when the description was published, it was recognized as belonging to the same genus, Latimeria, named after Marjorie Courtney Latimer, as the South African specimen, which is Latimeria chalumni. This one is called Latimeria monadoensis, after the island near which it was caught. And it's quite a phenomenal thing that there are 2 living species of the coelacanth still alive today. Another important development back off the coast of Africa is that the president of the Comores took an interest in coelacanth conservation. The Coelacanth Conservation Center was established, and it's now fully protected, not only by law, but by the people and the fishermen and other citizens of the Comores. Then another big surprise, mixed gas divers led by Peter Tim in 2000 found a colony of living coelacanths in the Isimangaliso Wetland Park in northern Zululand. And that colony has continued to be studied. I think 26 specimens are known from it by their individual pattern of dots, and they live in canyons off Sodwana Bay and area on either side. So there's Sodwana Bay, Jessa Point, the Isimangaliso Wetland Park. And sadly, Peter Tim died in a diving accident subsequently, a diving accident not associated with coelacanth research, but other work. But the dive company that he established, Triton Dive Lodge, still exists. And if you have the right mixed gas diving qualifications and experience, you can dive with coelacanths. Of course, we're in the era of robotics, and it was inevitable that the next personality on the scene would be a robot. And this is the CI robot that belongs to the Ichthyology Institute in Grahamstown. And it was used during ASEP, the African Coelacanth Ecosystem Program, in the Isimangaliso Wetland Park and elsewhere to study coelacanths. And here's another character in the whole drama, the famous underwater photographer from Italy, Laurent Ballesta. And you can see one of his exquisite photographs of the coelacanth, made possible, of course, by the docile nature of this creature, which isn't easily frightened. And then on the right, another key character in the modern coelacanth story, Dr. Kerry Sink, who's at the South African National Biodiversity Institute at Kirstenbosch. And she was, as part of the ASEP program, she played many roles, but one of them was coordinating research on the sort of the dot fingerprint of coelacanths, in identifying the individual fishes and following them through the years. In 2003, coelacanths were discovered off Tanzania, and sadly, many have been caught and killed there, over 80 in the last 15 odd years. And this is a female which had some 26 young in it. You can see them displayed on the table there, which is a terrible loss for a coelacanth population, because we know that they're very slow breeders, they produce very few eggs and young. So it's a disaster when this number of young die. In 2013, the Coelacanth genome was described for the very first time, which is a formidable achievement, published in Nature, a paper with 98 different authors, but a South African-led project. And amongst other things, the genome indicated that although the coelacanth is close to the evolution of backboned animals from the sea onto the land where they became the tetrapods or four-legged animals, we now believe that the lungfish is even closer to that lineage. Then as recently as November 2019, just last year, amateur mixed gas divers photographed a coelacanth off Hebridean on the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal. Enormously exciting discovery, because that's more or less halfway between Isimangaliso Wetland Park and East London, and which suggests that coelacanths may in fact be distributed all along our coast. And there you can see the dive team, all of them highly expert divers, but amateurs who are professionals in other fields. But what is even more remarkable is that they've been back to that site over and over again, and they haven't seen a coelacanth a second time. So it shows just how elusive the animal is. Now, I'm coming to the end now. My most recent research over the last 2 years has been on coelacanths in Madagascar. And there you can see a typical way in which a coelacanth would be delivered to the museum in a sort of rickshaw cart. Working with Andrew Cook and Minnesota Ravalola Harinja in Madagascar. We've recently reviewed research there. 33 specimens of the coelacanth are known from Madagascar, for which we can trace specimens or photographs, but we're convinced that several times that have in fact been caught and have not been properly recorded. And we're currently working on a conservation plan for coelacanths in Madagascar, and I'm now also collaborating with researchers in Tanzania on the same thing. Now, one of the most fascinating things to me about the coelacanth is not only has an interesting natural history and sort of array of actors in its drama, it also has an interesting cultural history. And possibly more than any other fish, it's been portrayed in arts and crafts, on postage stamps. It's had poems written about it. There was a Hollywood movie, The Creature of the Black Lagoon. So it's entered human cultures in many ways. And I have, over the years, made a collection of coelacanth craftworks. Here you can see some of them. And most recently, I've been commissioning amateur street artists to make coelacanth models using the material that they would normally use. So bottom left, you can see a carved wooden one. The top ones are made out of scrap metal, and the bottom right, a coke tin coelacanth. And here's some other examples. Top left, one made out of bits of flip-flops, Play-Doh, wire and beads, and then twisted wire. So this is my current hobby, collecting and commissioning coelacanth specimens. So just to say again, if you want to read more about the story, this is where to go. The Fishy Smiths, about JLB and Margaret, Curator and Crusader, about Marjorie Courtney Latimer, and that published by David Hilton Barber from Hermanus. My autobiography, When I Was a Fish, The Amazing Coelacanth, and then the Annotated Old Fourlegs is a book in which we've republished JLB Smith's Old Fourlegs, and I brought it up to date with new introduction, concluding chapters, and notes on either side of the original text. So that's my story. Thank you for being with me. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly fascinating and very entertaining. Thank you so much. If any of you have any questions, please won't you put them in the chat function. We would really appreciate that, and I can ask Mike any of the questions you might have. Just from my side, I know Kerry and her team were doing a lot of work on helping to proclaim new marine protected areas in the ocean. Are any of these new protected MPAs part of where the coelacanths are being found? Essentially, the question is, the area where they currently exist along the South African coastline, are they being protected in any way?
Yes, they certainly are protected in the Isimangalisa Wetland Park, which is a World Heritage Site. So it's very fortunate that that's where they're living. But the work that Kerry's doing in the with, team of people on declaring new MPAs all around the South African coast, and we'll only in future realize the fantastic benefit of that as we study the fauna and flora in these places and realize what lives there, and potentially in the Eastern Cape could harvest coelacanth populations, which we haven't discovered as yet. My feeling is there's still a great deal to discover about the coelacanths. We don't know the full story at all yet.
A question is coming through. Did fishermen reject the concept of eating the coelacanths?
Not many people eat coelacanths. I actually tasted some once, just to have the knowledge of what it tastes like. It tastes a bit like sort of cotton wool dipped in paraffin. It's a very oily fish. In fact, the original specimen caught in 1938 in the East London Museum is still dripping oil, and it's not at all palatable. The only people who we've found eat it occasionally are fishermen in Madagascar. And it's not as if they eat it only when they're starving, they eat it in the normal course of events. And quite a few specimens that we know were caught were not donated to a museum because the fishermen wanted to eat it. There have been 1 or 2 reports from Anjouan and from the mainland of Tanzania of coelacanths being eaten, but it's not common. So, its taste and something for us to eat is not a threat to the coelacanth.
You mentioned that 80 were caught in Tanzania. It sounded like a big number. Just in terms of numbers, are you worried about the number of coelacanths that we know are still alive, or what is the current situation in terms of numbers?
Well, there are a number of threats to coelacanths. One of them is pollution. A fish, coelacanth caught off Comores in fairly deep water, was found to have very high concentrations of insecticides, DDT, DDE in it. We also have found coelacanths with plastic bags in the intestines. But the biggest threat to them is monofilament gill nets, which are now being extensively used up the east coast of Africa and the Western Indian Ocean islands, mainly to catch sharks for shark fin and shark oil. And coelacanths are actually accidentally caught in these nets, and all of the coelacanths known to have been caught off Tanzania, except for 2, were caught in large mesh gill nets. And sadly, explosives are also increasingly being used in Tanzania and even in the Comores. And of course, they damage the habitat. And then overfishing of the fishes that the coelacanth feeds on, because it's a piscivore, a predator, is also a threat to them. So although we're very glad to know that they're more widely distributed than we first thought, and may even be more widely distributed than we know now, there certainly are populations of them, for instance, off Tanzania, which are threatened.
I know there seems to be a lot of interest in deep sea mining along our coastline. I know the gas reserves up in northern Mozambique, although there's some terrorism activity going around there at the moment. Are you concerned about threats of deep sea mining or exploration affecting that at all?
Yeah, especially because one of the sites that is being explored or may be explored for oil is quite near the Isimangalisa Wetland Park. And we know what happens with an oil spill. You can't contain the oil. And even though the exploration site might be outside the park, if there's a bad spill, it could affect the park, as is happening in Mauritius right now. So that is definitely a concern.
Mike, a question from Meredith Thornton is asking, thank you for a great, fascinating presentation. Has anything been discovered about the relatedness between individuals within groups at this stage?
No, we don't know things at that level of resolution. We do know that coelacanths quite often go back to the same cave where they shelter during the day, and that the same individuals might gather together, but it's not always exactly the same group of fishes. We don't think that they pair bond, and although I predict that they do care for their young after birth, this has never been observed. So there's still a great deal for us to discover.
Mike, thank you so much. That was an incredibly fascinating hour, and I appreciate all the work you put into that presentation. Thank you to the 50 of you who have joined us. Please remember that this is being recorded, so you are very welcome to share it, and it will be put up tomorrow on YouTube and Facebook and all the others. And thank you again. I look forward to reading your books, and I urge everyone else to go out there and get them and read them. Thanks again. I appreciate you taking the time. And thanks everyone for joining us. The next talk will be in a month's time. We've moved it not to be bi-weekly, but now to be monthly, now that we are back to level 1. Thank you very much. Have a great evening. Thank you. Bye.